This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 14 of season 4 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, April 8th, 1911, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Mrs. Will E. Carver and baby daughter are staying with Mr. and Mrs. John Feeney. Master Morton Seavey was taken to the Lowell General Hospital last week for the removal of adenoids. The majors in quotes, must have been his nickname. The major met this ordeal with characteristic philosophy and is now quite his sturdy self again. Leon Hildreth, who has been having the week of vacation from the Lowell High School, has been enjoying a visit with his old schoolmate, John Draper, at Auburndale. Miss Lillian Draper, with her mother, Mrs. Nellie P. Draper, have returned from a trip to New York City, where they visited a Wellesley classmate of Miss Lillian. George T. Day, who has been on the sick list, is more comfortable. Mr. and Mrs. Houghton Osgood enjoyed visiting last week Reverend and Mrs. Charles Marshall at their home in Quincy. Mr. Marshall likes his Quincy pastorate, although its conditions vary much from his former work here. Both Mr. and Mrs. Marshall sent friendliest greetings to their many friends here. Reverend Marshall was pastor of the Congregational Church on Lincoln Street in Westford Center from 1905 to 1910. Miss Grace Lumbert, who has been for several weeks with her brother and family in Oxford, has returned home and is improving from her recent ill turn. Henry M. Wright of Quincy has been spending several days this week with his brother Hammett D. Wright. Miss Julia Hall has been enjoying the spring vacation at home from her teaching and was a guest at the Tadmuck Club on Tuesday. She was the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Harrison Hall. A pleasant whist party was held in the parlors of the Unitarian Vestry last week, Friday evening. The arrangements were in charge of Mrs. Alonzo Sutherland and Mrs. Herbert Hildreth. Mrs. Noah Prescott attained the highest score. Her refreshments of chocolate and cake were served. The Edward M. Abbott Hose Company held its regular monthly meeting on Tuesday evening at headquarters on Boston Road. Fred A. Smith served a most attractive supper, and a social evening was enjoyed. At a meeting of the selectmen last Saturday evening, David Grieg and John Healy were licensed as undertakers. Alec Fisher was granted a slaughterhouse license. David Grieg was appointed hearse driver. Henry Keyes was refused a permit to move a windmill tower through the streets of the town. You may recall that Mr. Keyes had moved the old Westford Academy building from from the Common on Boston Road over to its present position as the Westford Museum, and apparently something broke down in the middle of that and blocked the street for a day or two. So I don't know if that was the reason he was refused a license this time or not. A.L. Griffin and family of Lawrence, who have bought the Clarence Reed farm, are expected to take possession at once. The next section is on the Tadmuck Club. The regular meeting of the Tadmuck Club took place in Library Hall on Tuesday afternoon. The pretty building, fresh from its spring cleaning and renovating, looked especially attractive. The program for the afternoon was the last in the series for the season's special study of Spanish North America that have proved most interesting and instructive. The special topic for this meeting was Florida, in charge of Mrs. David Wallace. Mrs. Wallace read a paper entitled The Story of Florida by Miss Eudora Jones of Lunenburg. Miss Jones was unable to be present in person, but her ably written paper was much appreciated. Miss Lillian Atwood contributed a second paper called Experiences in a Sailboat on a Florida River. This was the most original chronicle of a trip of 2 weeks between Daytona and Palm Beach on the Indian River, which is really an inlet of the Atlantic Ocean. Miss Clara Smith read this paper for Miss Atwood, who was not able to be present. The club voted a vote of thanks to the writers of these two papers. The president appointed a nominating committee to report at the next meeting, which is the annual meeting consisting of Mrs. Fletcher, Foster, and Norris. Flowers and greetings were sent to Miss Mary Drew at the Lowell General Hospital. The next meeting will be a literary topic and holds much promise of interest. It will be Victor Hugo, in charge of Miss Bunce and Miss Layton. New books are being added to the library. The next paragraph is a death. Mrs. Ellen H. Richards' death last week was learned with much sadness by her Westford friends. She was a native of our neighboring town of Dunstable, and with her parents moved to Westford about 1858. Supposedly they moved so that her father could put her into Westford Academy and she could get a good education there. She was a native of our neighboring town of Dunstable and with her parents moved to Westford about 1858. Her father, Peter Swallow, kept a store in the building owned by Homer Seavey between his house and the library. Nellie, as she was called at that time, and as she is pleasantly remembered by her contemporaries, attended Westford Academy while the Honorable John D. Long was principal. Her friends here have always followed her career with much pride and interest, and she, on her side, has always retained a sincere love and interest in Westford and its progress. Since the Tadmont Club was originated, she has addressed its members twice and was most appreciatively received. The first time was in December 1908 when she spoke on, quote, food values, end quote, and the second time in November 1909 on, quote, domestic science, end quote. Both of these addresses were full of wisdom and trained common sense. For more on her, see the Wikipedia article on Mrs. Richards. She was an American industrial and safety engineer, an environmental chemist, and a university faculty member prior to her death in 1911. Her pioneering work in sanitary engineering and in domestic science laid a foundation for those for the new science of home economics. I'll have a little more to read about Mrs. Richards at the end of the Westford section here. The next section is the About Town section. Seth Walker read as in quotes, I guess that's a nickname. Red Walker, who has been remembered with the visiting of La Grippe while in Worcester, is gathering back the last missing links of his former strength at the old open fireside of his boyhood home at the Walker Homestead of Hospitality at 148 Main Street. His son Charles is with him, taking on the tan of changeable breezy April. This is a humane improvement over the tan that the writer took in student days at the old Stony Brook School. The Advent Conference has returned Mr. Walker back to Lowell, where he was an eloquent and efficient exponent of the doctrines of that Seventh-day Advent Church. He has already arrived at his mission field and will live in Lowell. A Chelmsford farmer was seen plowing last Saturday. Come now, what are those Stony Brook farmers that plant peas in February and potatoes on St. Patrick's Day in the evening? Not a furrow started yet or a seed left the warm chimney closet, and at the time of writing we are more threatened with thoughts of a sleigh ride than thoughts of eating green peas on June 10th, as last year's February planting declared a dividend on that date. Albert Taylor observed Sunday with friends in town. He is still a landscape gardener with Warren Manning of Boston. The farm which William Taylor recently purchased has a small growth, mostly oak, on the steep bank overhanging the Stony Brook. Close to the water's edge is a tree known as the level wood, and authorities say there's only one other tree like it in town. For a bill of particulars, inquire of John Australia O'Brien on the Vos Road. He owns the other specimen. I don't think Australia was really the middle name of John O'Brien, but his family came to Westford from Australia. Surveyors have been working on the Stony Brook Road, spending considerable time at the bridge spanning the Stony Brook Highway. Rumor has it to mean a new iron bridge in place of the low wooden structure, and continued surveying elsewhere is interpreted as double-tracking the road. It is nearly certain now that the Nashua and Acton Road will have new and heavier rails laid in the spring. The assessors are on the hustle of a search to get on the trail of the sources from whence cometh that money voted at the annual town meeting. Irving Wright was in town on Sunday visiting his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Wiley M. Wright. He is employed in a paper mill at Westbrook, Maine, and has 3 children, the youngest 10 days old. George W. Hunt, an old-timer in the Stony Brook district, was in town on Sunday looking for those that are left. Several of the children of lawyer James Stewart Murphy of Lowell are enjoying the sleigh ride days of April at the old Oaken Bucket Farm at the corner of Lowell and Stony Brook Road, close by the sheltering pines on the northern slope of Francis Hill. That was, of course, the home farm of Samuel L. Taylor, who writes the About Town section of the Westford Wardsman. Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey gave a historical and inspiring account of his stewardship of 50 years in the ministry at the Unitarian Church last Sunday, reviewing the important events and changes, theological and social, that have taken place since his ordination at Dedham and the parishes he has served at Portland, Gloucester, and Westford. These churches have all had an ancient and honorable record, and noted men and women of courage and opinion, the Westford Church being the youngest organized on November 27, 1727. The next paragraph is called Home Source of Supply. George C. Moore would like to accommodate the town with electricity by putting in a plant at his mill at Westford Station and making a general clearing up of this property. Talk about killing 2 birds with 1 stone. This is the nearest aim at it the town has had since it was incorporated. True, it would necessarily cause a little delay in lighting the streets, but what of a few months' continuation without lights when we remember that we have been more than 6,000 years without lighting the streets? Compared with this, a few months diminishes to a moment. We can afford to grope in darkness an additional moment for the sake of the home source of supply. If this is not a good Board of Trade doctrine, lay down some foreign proposition and disprove it. Unfortunately, this power plant that was to be built in Westford was never built. The next section is the Forge Village section. Lenten services were held in St. Andrew's Mission on Wednesday evening and were well attended. A meeting of the Girls' Friendly Society followed the service, and the Ladies' Sewing Circle held their regular meeting on Wednesday afternoon. Mrs. William Flanagan is still confined to her home by illness. The many friends of Matthew Elliott will be sorry to learn of his illness. The personal property and stock in the store owned by George Mountain was sold at public auction on Wednesday. The house, furniture, store, and contents, and all property belonging to Victor Pigeon were sold at public auction on Thursday and Friday of this week. Mr. Pigeon is to remove west. Cameron School reopened Monday morning after the vacation of 2 weeks. Joseph Leclerc and family of North Chelmsford have removed to their home on Central Street. Mrs. Herbert Northrup has left for Pepperell, where she has accepted a position on the Peck Farm. Sounds like a lot of people are leaving town. Mrs. John Morton of Lowell visited with her sister, Mrs. Fenimore Morton, this week. Little Miss Laura Morton is now the guest of her aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. John Morton of Lowell. The choir in charge of Mrs. Mary F. Hanley are rehearsing for High Mass to be sung on Easter Sunday. This would be the St. Catherine's Choir. Mrs. Joseph LaCourse is confined to her home by illness. Next, I'd like to read a short obituary from the Groton Landmark, which is another part of Turner's Public Spirit, the newspaper that the Westford Wardsman appears in. This is it's an obituary of Ellen Richards. Last Sunday, Myron and Marshall Swallow were called to Trinity Chapel, Boston, to the funeral of their cousin, Mrs. Ellen H. Richards, who died at her home in Jamaica Plain March 30th after a brief illness. She was the daughter of Peter and Fanny Taylor Swallow and was born in Dunstable, December 3rd, 1842. In 1870, she graduated from Vassar College and received the degree of A.M. in 1873, and from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the degree of S.B. In 1875, she was married to Professor Robert Richards, the oldest alumnus of the Institute, an active mining engineer and professor at Tech. He was a professor at MIT and also a graduate. Mrs. Richards was a great worker and valuable professor in sanitary chemistry and many other branches of science. In the investigation of the state water supply, over 10,000 samples were sent to her laboratory for analysis. During the 35 years that she has dispersed scientific knowledge and conducted original research work at the Institute as professor of water, air, and food analysis, she has written practical books on chemistry of cooking and cleaning, food materials and their adulterations, home sanitation, the cost of living, air, water, and food, first lessons in minerals, the cost of food, the cost of shelter, first lessons in food and diet, the art of right living, and sanitation and daily life. Those were all titles of her various books. The Boston Journal said, quote, "In the death of Mrs. Richards, Massachusetts Institute of Technology loses a brilliant member of its faculty, and America loses one of its foremost women scientists. Her studies in water, food, and air won for her a place in the front rank of women scientists of the world, and she was in great demand in all parts of the country as a lecturer and consulting expert on these subjects. She had the unusual distinction for a woman being a member of the American Institute of Mining Engineers and was president of the Home Economics Association," end quote. She was not actually a professor at MIT. I don't believe. She was an instructor, though. That's the news from Westford for the week ending April 8th, 1911. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of Westford CAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.